The first time I heard about it, nobody said the word directly. That's how things worked where I grew up. The biggest secrets were never spoken clearly. They lived inside whispers, inside silence, inside the way people suddenly stopped saying someone's name. I remember sitting at the dinner table one evening when I noticed something strange. A woman from our community hadn't come to church that Sunday. At first, nobody mentioned it. But then I noticed the adults exchanging quiet looks across the table, small pauses, careful voices, and suddenly, the entire room felt different, heavy. I didn't understand why yet, but even as a young girl, I could feel something serious had happened. My father kept eating quietly. My mother barely looked up. Then finally, my aunt whispered softly, "They're having trouble in the marriage." That was all she said, but the silence afterward told me far more than the words did.
I didn't understand it then, but in Amish communities, shame often arrives long before the full truth does. That realization stayed with me for years, because growing up, marriage wasn't treated like a personal relationship. It felt sacred, public, connected to faith, family, reputation, and community all at once. So when betrayal entered a marriage, it didn't affect only two people. It shook entire families emotionally. That's the part outsiders rarely understand. Cheating wasn't viewed as just a private mistake. It carried spiritual weight, community weight, emotional weight. And because of that, people often became quieter instead of more honest. That's when something started to feel off for me. Not because cheating itself surprised me, because I realized how fear and silence controlled everything surrounding it. Nobody openly discussed emotional struggles inside marriage. Nobody openly discussed loneliness either. And when people stop talking honestly about emotions, those emotions don't disappear. They simply go underground. I remember another woman once telling me something quietly after a church gathering. We were washing dishes together while everyone else talked in the next room, and suddenly she whispered, "Some people become strangers long before they betray each other." I never forgot that sentence, because years later, I finally understood what she meant. Many couples looked stable publicly, quiet, respectful, faithful, but privately. Some felt emotionally isolated for years, and emotional isolation changes people slowly. Night after night, distance grows quietly between two people. Every morning, they continue pretending everything feels normal. And eventually, some begin searching for emotional connection elsewhere. That's the dark truth nobody openly talked about. Not just betrayal itself, the loneliness that often existed long before it. At the time, I told myself this was normal adulthood, that maybe all marriages eventually became emotionally quiet. But deep inside, something resisted that explanation, because healthy relationships require honesty, and honesty cannot survive properly inside fear and silence forever. I remember hearing about a man years later who had been accused of cheating. Nobody discussed details openly, but suddenly, people treated him differently, not loudly, quietly. The men stopped joking with him as comfortably. The women lowered their voices whenever he passed nearby, and his wife looked emotionally exhausted every time I saw her. That image stayed with me longer than the rumors themselves, because betrayal doesn't just damage trust, it damages identity, safety, self-worth, especially inside communities where marriage is deeply connected to spiritual life. I didn't understand it then, but shame becomes overwhelming when an entire community silently watches your pain. That pressure changes people deeply, especially women taught to endure emotional suffering quietly. One older woman admitted something heartbreaking to me years later. We were sitting outside after supper while the sky slowly turned dark, and very softly, she said, "Some marriages survive betrayal publicly, but never recover emotionally." Then she looked away and added, "But nobody talks about that part." That sentence changed the way I viewed marriage forever, because people often focus on whether cheating happened, but they rarely talk honestly about what emotional betrayal does to people internally. The self-doubt, the humiliation, the fear, the emotional numbness afterward. Those wounds stay long after rumors disappear, and inside communities built around silence, healing becomes even harder, because many people never learn how to speak honestly about emotional pain. That's the part outsiders rarely see. The emotional isolation underneath everything. I remember another woman quietly admitting something after her husband betrayed her emotionally. She said, "The hardest part wasn't what he did." Then she paused for several seconds before whispering, "The hardest part was pretending I was okay afterward." That sentence broke something inside me, because suddenly I realized how many people carried enormous emotional pain while still trying to appear spiritually strong. That pressure destroys people quietly, not all at once, slowly. That's what silence does. It teaches people how to hide suffering instead of healing it honestly, and eventually, many stop recognizing their own emotional needs completely. That realization frightened me later in life, because emotional honesty matters. Not just rules, not just appearances, real honesty. Without it, relationships slowly become performances instead of connections. Looking back now, I don't think cheating was the only tragedy. Sometimes the deeper tragedy was how emotionally disconnected people already felt long before betrayal happened. Loneliness existed quietly inside many marriages. But nobody talked about loneliness openly either. Everything stayed hidden, and hidden pain always grows heavier with time. I didn't understand it then, but silence shapes relationships long before they break apart. It teaches people which emotions deserve expression, and which emotions should stay buried quietly. That emotional silence affected nearly everything: communication, trust, vulnerability, forgiveness, healing, everything. Looking back now, I think some marriages could have survived emotional struggles more honestly if people had felt safe enough to speak openly before things became unbearable. But emotional openness felt unfamiliar to many people growing up inside silence. That's what stayed with me longest. Not the scandal, not the gossip. The loneliness underneath it all. Because once people stop emotionally seeing each other clearly, distance quietly enters the relationship long before betrayal ever does. And maybe that's the part nobody talks about enough. Not cheating itself, the emotional isolation that slowly builds before it. If you're still listening, maybe part of this story feels familiar to you too. Maybe you've experienced relationships where silence slowly replaced honesty, where people looked fine publicly, while privately feeling disconnected and alone. If you have, you're not weak, and you're not alone. That's something I wish more people understood earlier. Some things stay with you, not as memories, but as emotional habits your body learns long before your mind fully understands them. And maybe, speaking honestly about these things now, is the first step toward finally breaking that silence. If this story connected with you, leave a comment below. Sometimes hearing "me too" helps people feel human again. And if you want more honest stories people usually stay silent about, subscribe, because maybe these conversations matter more than we realize.